Hello, my friend. Welcome to Humorously Dull History for Sleep. My name is Stephen Dalton, and it is my hope that as I tell you lots of different facts about particular periods in history tonight, you find me so incredibly boring that you fall asleep very quickly, and maybe even with a smile upon your face. It is humorous history after all. Tonight I'll tell you the humorously dull history of Shakespeare. Yes, Shakespeare. William Shakespeare, obviously. Not Trevor Shakespeare, who I went to school with. Nice enough guy, but probably not worth an entire sleep story. So, just before we get started, allow yourself to settle into this moment. Leave the day that was behind. Feel the support of whatever you lie upon. If your eyes aren't closed yet, allow them to close. Whatever has been, has been. It's history now. Whatever will be, will be. All you have is this moment, and my voice, so allow your curiosity to be a part of this pleasant experience as I tell you the humorously dull history of Shakespeare. Part 1, in which William Shakespeare is born, and nobody realizes this will eventually become homework. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, probably on or around the 23rd of April. We say probably because nobody actually recorded the precise day of his birth. What we do have is a record of his baptism at Holy Trinity Church on the 26th of April, and babies were commonly baptized soon after birth. This is worth remembering whenever Shakespeare's life begins to feel very grand. One of the most famous human beings who ever lived enters history with everybody already slightly unsure about the date. There is no birth announcement, no photograph, no proud message from John and Mary Shakespeare informing several hundred acquaintances that mother and baby are doing well. Nobody writes beneath it, "Welcome to the world, little William, love heart." Instead, 3 days after the date traditionally accepted as his birthday, somebody writes his baptism into a parish register, and that's about it. William is born into a reasonably prosperous family. His father, John Shakespeare, is a glove maker and leather worker, who also deals in other goods, and becomes involved in Stratford's local government. His mother, Mary Arden, comes from a family of local landowners. William is therefore neither born into aristocratic splendor nor raised in desperate poverty. He grows up in a busy market town in Warwickshire, in a household that at least during his earlier childhood seems to have been doing reasonably well. Stratford, in the 1560s, is a town of perhaps a couple of thousand people, There are timber-framed houses, workshops, markets, animals, carts, and streets, which bear very little resemblance to the carefully maintained Stratford visited by tourists today. There is no Shakespeare gift shop. This is mainly because Shakespeare is 7. You cannot yet buy a mug with his face on it. Nobody is walking around Stratford saying, "Apparently that's where Shakespeare lives." They're saying, "That's John Shakespeare's boy." And even this may not be particularly interesting. John has several children. William is simply one of them. This is perhaps our first opportunity to remove Shakespeare from the pedestal he will eventually occupy, because the Shakespeare we inherit comes surrounded by importance. Portraits, busts, collected works, university departments, actors speaking very slowly while looking into the middle distance. The Shakespeare of 1570 is but a small boy. Elizabeth I has been queen since 1558. England is Protestant again after the reign of the Catholic Mary I, and religion remains deeply connected to politics and everyday life. Europe is divided by religious conflict. England is still decades away from becoming the great imperial power it later becomes. None of this concerns little William as much as whatever little William is currently doing. This is one of the useful things about childhood. History can be happening elsewhere, and you may still be mainly concerned that somebody else has your stick. We cannot reconstruct Shakespeare's childhood in intimate detail, and this is going to happen repeatedly throughout his story. For perhaps the most famous writer in the English language, Shakespeare has been remarkably inconsiderate about leaving us information about himself. There are documents, legal records, property transactions, marriage records, business dealings, a will, references by contemporaries, but there is no Shakespeare diary, no collection of letters explaining his private thoughts, no interview in which he tells us when he first became interested in theatre. This has allowed several centuries of scholars to enjoy themselves enormously. Where evidence ends, theories begin, and Shakespeare has provided enough empty space to keep everybody occupied. He probably attended the King's New School in Stratford, although no surviving school register proves his attendance. As the son of a prominent townsman, however, he would have been entitled to an education there, and his later writing demonstrates the kind of knowledge such a grammar school education could provide. If he attended, the school day would have been long, very long. Elizabethan grammar schools placed enormous emphasis on Latin. Boys studied grammar, rhetoric, and classical authors. They translated passages from Latin into English, and English back into Latin. They memorized. They recited. Then they did some more Latin. There is no PowerPoint. There is no educational video. Nobody wheels in a television because the teacher has had enough. The teacher is still very much involved. A schoolboy Shakespeare may spend hours working through writers such as Ovid, Virgil, Cicero, Seneca, and Plautus. These classical texts later leave obvious marks on his work. This means that somewhere inside A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, and Romeo and Juliet are the distant consequences of a boy being made to study things he may not always have felt like studying. School has achieved its revenge. The schoolroom itself would have been disciplined and demanding. Lessons could begin early, particularly in summer, and corporal punishment was accepted. William, therefore, does not spend childhood sitting beneath a tree composing sonnets. He is learning Latin grammar, possibly while wishing Latin had never happened. At home, meanwhile, his father's business brings young William close to the practical world of tradesmen and craftsmen. Glove-making involves animal skins and leather, substances considerably less romantic than later portraits of Shakespeare suggest. A finished glove may be elegant. The process leading to it is not necessarily something you would put on the tourist brochure. John Shakespeare also rises in Stratford's civic life. He holds several municipal positions and eventually becomes bailiff, effectively the town's leading civic official. For the family, this means status. For young William, it means his father is involved in local government. Every child eventually discovers that their parents have a life which is extremely important to other adults and almost completely uninteresting to them. John attends meetings. Decisions are made. William presumably survives. One particularly useful consequence of John's position is that travelling companies of actors could perform in Stratford before local officials, including the bailiff. It is therefore quite possible that William encountered professional theatre while still young. We should resist turning this into a cinematic moment. A travelling company does not arrive. Young William does not stand at the back transfixed. A beam of sunlight does not fall across his face. Nobody whispers, "That boy will change theatre forever." He may have watched. He may have enjoyed it. Then presumably everyone went home. History is extremely frustrating like that. We know what happened later, So we want earlier moments to behave as though they know too. They don't. Meanwhile, the Shakespeare family's fortunes appear to decline during William's adolescence. John begins withdrawing from civic life and experiences financial difficulties. The precise reasons remain debated, although records show debts, property dealings, and legal problems. And then, at 18, William does something about which we have much firmer evidence. He gets married. His bride is Anne Hathaway. She is 26. William is 18. Anne is also pregnant. Suddenly, the documentation becomes rather more interesting. Their marriage license is issued in November 1582, and their daughter, Susanna, is baptized in May 1583. You do not need to be Shakespeare to work out the chronology. There is no Instagram announcement explaining that the couple are overjoyed to begin this next chapter. There is paperwork. The paperwork has dates. The dates have done enough. Anne Hathaway comes from Shottery, near Stratford. Despite the enormous attention later given to their marriage, we know frustratingly little about the relationship itself. 8 years between husband and wife was unusual enough to attract later comment, particularly because Anne was older, but it was perfectly legal. What Shakespeare thought about his marriage, what Anne thought about Shakespeare, and how happy either of them were, cannot be confidently reconstructed from the surviving evidence. This has not prevented people trying. Shakespeare's scholarship has occasionally treated a marriage about which we know very little, rather like an online hotel review, with half the text missing. People still feel confident giving it a rating. In 1585, Anne gives birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith. William Shakespeare is now 21 years old. He has a wife, 3 children, a father experiencing financial difficulties, and, as far as anyone knows, absolutely no career as the greatest playwright in English history. This is quite a useful age at which to meet him, because if we stop here and pretend we don't know what happens next, William Shakespeare's future is not obvious at all. He is a young married man from a provincial market town. His education has probably ended. He has a family to support. There is no university degree. There are no published plays. There is no Globe Theatre. There is no Hamlet. There is no Macbeth. There is not yet a single exhausted teenager staring at Romeo and Juliet and wondering why everyone couldn't simply communicate better. And then Shakespeare disappears. Not literally. That would at least make the next part easier to explain. But after the baptism of his twins in 1585, the documentary record becomes very quiet until he emerges in London as a playwright and actor by the early 1590s. These years are often called Shakespeare's lost years. Naturally, people have filled them. Perhaps he worked as a schoolmaster. Perhaps he travelled with actors. Perhaps he worked in the legal profession. Perhaps he fled Stratford after getting into trouble for poaching deer. The deer story is particularly persistent because history enjoys nothing more than a famous man beginning his career by annoying a landowner. But firm evidence is lacking. What we can say is that somewhere between young fatherhood in Stratford and the early 1590s, William Shakespeare becomes involved with the London theatre world. And London theatre is going to suit us much better. Because once Shakespeare gets there, we suddenly have actors, audiences, rival playwrights, money, plague, drinking, heckling, costumes, theatres, and several thousand Londoners who have paid a penny to stand in a yard and would quite like something interesting to happen. Shakespeare is about to become Shakespeare. Nobody in Stratford knows this yet, including, quite possibly, Shakespeare. Part 2, in which Shakespeare goes to London and discovers that the theatre is full of actors. Somewhere between 1585 and 1592, William Shakespeare leaves the relatively small world of Stratford-upon-Avon and becomes part of the theatre business in London. We do not know exactly when. We do not know exactly why. We do not even know exactly how. This is slightly inconvenient when telling his story, but it does save us from spending 20 minutes pretending we know which road he took. What we do know is that by 1592, Shakespeare is established enough in London's theatrical world for another writer to be annoyed by him. This is excellent evidence. Praise can take time. Professional resentment is often much quicker. The writer Robert Greene attacks Shakespeare in a pamphlet published that year, famously calling him an upstart crow, and apparently objecting to this actor who has begun writing plays and competing with university-educated dramatists. And this tells us something rather wonderful. Whatever Shakespeare has been doing during those missing years, by 1592 he has become successful enough to irritate somebody. His career is underway. To understand what that means, though, we need to get Shakespeare off the page for a moment and put him into London. Because this is not the London of quiet museums, coffee shops, and people standing on escalators while looking at their phones. This is a rapidly growing Elizabethan city of perhaps 150,000 people by the end of the 16th century, though estimates vary. It is crowded, noisy, smoky and busy. Streets are narrow. Carts, horses, traders, servants, apprentices and animals compete for space. The Thames is one of the city's great transport routes, and small boats carry passengers across and along it. There are no traffic lights. There are barely any lights, and everybody seems to have somewhere to be. Shakespeare arrives from a town containing perhaps a couple of thousand inhabitants, and finds himself in one of Europe's great cities. There is no estate agent waiting to show him a pleasant one-bedroom property conveniently situated for the theatre district. We don't actually know exactly where he first lives. Later records place him at different addresses in London, and like many Londoners, he appears to rent accommodation rather than immediately purchasing a home there. This creates an appealingly ordinary beginning to one of literature's grandest careers. William Shakespeare, future national icon, needs somewhere to put his things. London is also filthy by modern standards. Waste disposal is imperfect. Streets can be muddy. Animals are common. Open drains and all sorts of smells are part of urban life. Elizabethans themselves complain about London's dirt and odours, so we needn't imagine everybody walking around completely unaware of it. They know. There just isn't an app for reporting it. And into this crowded city comes a man hoping to make a living in theatre. This is not an obviously respectable career choice. Theatre is enormously popular, but actors occupy an uncertain social position. Acting companies require the patronage of powerful nobles, partly because laws concerning vagabonds could make life difficult for performers without recognized protection. In other words, Shakespeare enters a profession in which being associated with a wealthy aristocrat can help establish that you are an actor rather than simply a group of men wandering around in costumes. The distinction is worth documenting. London already has purpose-built public theatres. The theatre, called The Theatre, had opened in Shoreditch in 1576, followed by The Curtain nearby. These are outside the direct jurisdiction of the city authorities, some of whom regard theatrical entertainment with considerable suspicion. The objections are numerous. Theatres gather large crowds. Crowds encourage disorder. People drink. People neglect work. Young apprentices may go to performances when they should be doing something considerably less enjoyable. There are also moral concerns about acting itself. Essentially, London discovers popular entertainment, and almost immediately somebody wants it closed. This tradition will prove extremely durable. The theatre district is lively. Around the playhouses are taverns, food sellers, and other entertainments. Across the Thames in Southwark, where later theatres, including the Globe, will operate, visitors can also find inns, bear-baiting arenas, and various businesses considered undesirable by more respectable authorities. The Elizabethan theatre, therefore, does not exist inside the quiet cultural atmosphere we associate with Shakespeare today. Nobody enters carrying a program and whispers because the play is about to begin. The audience is coming in from London. They have been drinking. Some are eating. Some are talking. Some are standing. And Shakespeare is expected to get their attention. This is useful when thinking about the plays. A Shakespearean opening cannot spend 40 minutes gradually establishing atmosphere while everyone respectfully waits. Something needs to happen. A ghost appears. A fight begins. A witch starts talking. A ship is sinking. Two servants begin arguing about a woman. Shakespeare understands audiences. He does not have a notification telling him that viewers are leaving after the first 30 seconds. He has something much worse. He can see them. Public theatres can hold large audiences, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 in some cases. The cheapest spectators pay a penny to stand in the open yard around the stage. These spectators later become commonly known as groundlings, although the precise historical use of that term is more complicated than popular accounts sometimes suggest. For 1 penny you stand. For more money, you can sit in the galleries. The Elizabethan theatre has therefore invented premium seating. It simply hasn't yet discovered the phrase premium seating. There are no numbered seats. No one has row G, seat 14. You do not arrive carrying 2 drinks while saying sorry, sorry, sorry to 12 people who have to stand up. You find somewhere. The performance happens during daylight because the public theatres do not have modern stage lighting. There is relatively little scenery. The stage itself, costumes, props, and Shakespeare's language do much of the work. If the scene is now a forest, someone may simply tell you that you're in a forest. This saves enormous amounts of money on trees. The audience accepts the convention. They have imagination. they also paid 1 penny. Expectations are appropriately calibrated. Theatre companies operate commercially. This point matters enormously, because Shakespeare is not sitting alone, waiting for inspiration to descend upon him. The plays are business. A company needs audiences. Audiences need new material. New material needs to be written, rehearsed, and performed. Actors need paying. Costumes cost money. The theatre itself costs money. If nobody comes, everybody has a problem. Shakespeare is therefore not merely an artist. He becomes an actor, playwright, and eventually a shareholder in his company. This last part is extremely important to understanding his success. Shakespeare makes money not simply because he writes famous plays, but because he has a financial stake in the theatrical enterprise performing them. The greatest writer in the English language has, among other things, made a sensible business decision. This is rarely the part printed on inspirational posters. We don't know precisely what Shakespeare's earliest theatrical jobs were. Later traditions claim he began by holding horses outside theatres for wealthy patrons, but there is no solid contemporary evidence for that story. It is attractive because we enjoy careers that begin at the bottom. William Shakespeare holds horses. William Shakespeare becomes Shakespeare. LinkedIn would adore it. Unfortunately, history has declined to confirm the anecdote. What we can say is that he acts as well as he writes. Shakespeare appears in records as a performer, although he does not seem to become famous primarily for his acting. There are later traditions connecting him with roles such as the ghost in Hamlet and Adam in As You Like It. But we should be careful about treating every later claim as fact. Still, imagining Shakespeare as an actor is useful. He knows what it is like to stand on stage. He knows what actors can do. He knows what is difficult to say. He knows how long an audience will tolerate somebody talking. Admittedly, judging by some of the speeches, he occasionally decides to test the upper limit. But he writes for living performers, and all the female characters are originally performed by boys or young men, because women do not perform on the English public stage at this time. Juliet is played by a boy. Ophelia is played by a boy. Lady Macbeth is played by a boy. Cleopatra will eventually be played by a boy. And the Elizabethan audience accepts all of this perfectly happily. They haven't come to examine the casting policy. They've paid their penny. They're standing in a crowded theatre, and they want to be entertained. Fortunately for Shakespeare, this is beginning to be something he is rather good at. Part 3, in which Shakespeare gets a theatre and the audience brings its own lunch. By the mid-1590s, William Shakespeare is no longer simply a young man from Stratford who has somehow found his way into the London theatre business. He is writing regularly, acting, and working with the Lord Chamberlain's men, one of the leading theatrical companies in the city. And this is where Shakespeare's story becomes much easier for us, because although we may not know what he had for breakfast, or what he thought about on a Tuesday afternoon, we know quite a lot about the world in which his plays were performed. And it is wonderfully unlike the world in which they are performed now. Today, going to a Shakespeare play can involve a beautiful theatre, numbered seats, programs, intervals, and a general understanding that once the performance begins, everybody should stop talking. Elizabethan London has agreed to almost none of this. The public theatres are commercial entertainment. They need large audiences, and those audiences come from a broad range of London society. Merchants, craftsmen, apprentices, gentlemen, servants, and visitors to the city. The cheapest admission to the open yard of a public theatre costs around a penny. 1 penny gets you inside. It does not get you a seat. For that, you need to pay more. The Elizabethan theatre has therefore already discovered the basic principle of modern travel. Comfort is available, but apparently you've selected the wrong package. Those paying the cheapest price stand in the yard around the stage. A large theatre can hold thousands of spectators, so this is not an intimate evening in which Shakespeare quietly shares his latest thoughts with an attentive room. It is a crowd, and the crowd is close. The stage projects out among them, allowing actors to perform with spectators on several sides. There is no enormous distance separating performer and audience. If an actor is having a difficult afternoon, a substantial portion of London can see it from several feet away. There are no microphones. This places some responsibility on the actor. If Hamlet has something important to say, Hamlet needs to say it properly. Performances usually take place in the afternoon because the theatre relies on daylight. If the scene takes place at night, somebody tells you it is night. You accept this. If the next scene takes place in France, nobody rebuilds France. The actors come back on. You are now in France. It is an extraordinarily economical system. Shakespeare can move an audience from Denmark to a battlefield to a forest in the space of a few lines, largely because nobody has yet employed 47 people to change the scenery. And the audience understands the bargain. They will imagine the castle. Shakespeare will provide the words. Everybody gets home before dark. The audience itself is not sitting silently in darkness. People can talk, they can react, they can eat and drink. Food sellers operate around the theatres, and archaeological excavations at sites associated with London playhouses have found evidence including nut shells and fruit remains. So, while Shakespeare is producing some of the most celebrated lines in the English language, somebody may be eating hazelnuts. This feels important. We tend to approach Shakespeare now with an almost religious seriousness. His words are printed in enormous collected editions. Actors discuss the text. Scholars analyze individual lines for decades. The original audience contains a man trying to open a nut, and somewhere nearby, another man wishes he would stop. This, I think, brings us considerably closer to the real theatre. The audience could also be demanding. They had choices. London's playhouses competed for their money, and new plays were needed regularly. Shakespeare cannot simply write Romeo and Juliet, receive 5 stars, and leave it running for 18 months. The repertory system changes constantly. Different plays are performed on different days. Actors have to know numerous roles. The company needs fresh material, which means Shakespeare is writing for people who may have been at another theatre yesterday and could quite easily go somewhere else tomorrow. There are no online reviews. If Shakespeare's new comedy is dreadful, you cannot check before leaving home. There is no warning from Thomas of Cheapside. 2 stars, first half promising, fool irritating, would not see again. You have paid your penny. You are already standing. William has you now. Word of mouth, of course, matters enormously. A successful play can draw audiences, and theatre companies depend on reputation. But the response is immediate, in a way modern writers rarely experience. Shakespeare can be present while people watch his work. Imagine that. You have spent weeks writing a comedy. You think a particular line is funny. An actor says it. 2,000 people hear it. Nothing. There is no place to hide. You cannot later explain that the audience didn't understand what you were trying to do. They understood. They simply continued eating. On another afternoon, a joke works magnificently. The crowd erupts. Shakespeare now knows. This constant contact with audiences must have mattered to the craft of anyone writing for the commercial stage. These playwrights learn what holds attention, what gets laughter, and what produces excitement, because the evidence is standing directly in front of them. Sometimes the evidence is drunk, but it is evidence. In 1599, Shakespeare's company acquires one of the most famous theatres in history, the Globe. And even the way the Globe comes into existence is wonderfully practical. The Lord Chamberlain's men had previously been using a playhouse known simply as the Theatre, built by James Burbage in Shoreditch. But there is a dispute over the lease of the land beneath it. The company has a problem. They own the theatre building. They do not own the ground. Eventually, during the winter of 1598 to 99, members of the company arrange for the theatre itself to be dismantled. Its timbers are taken across the Thames and reused in constructing the Globe in Southwark. This is one of my favourite facts about Shakespeare's theatrical world. The Globe does not simply appear because culture requires a suitable home for genius. They took the old theatre apart. They move it. They build it again in another place. Somewhere beneath centuries of Shakespearean prestige is a group of Elizabethan men saying, essentially, "We paid for that wood," and taking it with them. Shakespeare is financially involved too. He becomes one of the shareholders in the Globe, alongside other members of the company. Again, this is worth dwelling on, because our later image of Shakespeare tends to remove all the practical bits. We like Shakespeare holding a quill, Shakespeare thinking, Shakespeare gazing, Shakespeare receiving inspiration. We don't often picture Shakespeare discussing building costs, but theatre is his business. The success of the company matters directly to his income. He is not merely handing over scripts and disappearing mysteriously into the London fog. He has money in this. If the Globe does well, Shakespeare does well. If nobody comes, being a genius will not help with the accounts. The Globe stands on the south bank of the Thames in an area already associated with entertainment. To reach it from much of central London, spectators can cross the river or use boats. There are no signs announcing that the performance begins in 20 minutes and suggesting the fastest route. You know where the Globe is. It is the enormous theatre. Follow the people. The building is roughly circular or polygonal, with galleries surrounding an open central yard. A roof covers the galleries, while much of the yard remains exposed, which means weather matters. If it rains, the cheapest spectators get wet. The wealthier spectators under cover do not. The Elizabethan theatre has therefore managed to make rain class conscious. There is no retractable roof. There is no performance announcement saying, "Due to adverse weather conditions." The adverse weather conditions are attending the performance. A spectator in the yard may spend 2 or 3 hours standing outside while watching the play. This makes the penny admission seem both excellent value and slightly vindictive. And yet people come in large numbers. Theatre is hugely popular. For an ordinary Londoner, this is exciting mass entertainment. There are sword fights, ghosts, murders, jokes, love stories, kings, clowns, mistaken identities, and people disguising themselves with varying degrees of success. And as I mentioned earlier, all the women's roles are still being played by boys or young men. This allows Shakespeare to do something particularly entertaining in plays involving disguise. A male actor plays a woman. The woman disguises herself as a man. The audience is therefore watching a boy playing a woman playing a man. Everyone follows this particularly well. Modern audiences occasionally struggle because two characters have similar names. Elizabethans are expected to keep up. Costumes help enormously. Clothing is one of the great visual attractions of the stage, and companies invest heavily in elaborate garments. Rich costumes can signal rank and character immediately. This is particularly useful because scenery remains limited. You may not have a realistic palace, but you can have someone dressed like a king. The audience understands. King, good. We can proceed. Some costumes may have previously belonged to actual aristocrats before finding their way into theatrical use. Clothing is expensive, and garments can be passed on or sold. So, an actor playing a nobleman may be wearing something genuinely associated with the social world he is imitating. This is rather like discovering that the costume department has borrowed the king's actual trousers. Behind the stage, meanwhile, are the people who have to make all this work. And this is perhaps where Shakespeare's theatre becomes most recognizably human. Because however magnificent Hamlet may eventually become, on the afternoon it is performed, it still requires everybody to remember where they are supposed to stand. Shakespeare's company includes major performers such as Richard Burbage, one of the most celebrated actors of his generation. Burbage is believed to have originated many of Shakespeare's great leading roles, including Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, and Richard III, which means that for years, Burbage's working relationship with Shakespeare may have involved William handing him another play, and Burbage gradually discovering what fresh misery had been arranged for him. Who am I this time? A king. Good. Your daughters turn against you. Right. You lose everything, of course, and there's a storm. Naturally. Shakespeare rarely gives his leading men a quiet week. And these actors have an astonishing amount to remember. Theatre companies operate in what is called repertory, which means they perform different plays on different days, with far less rehearsal than a modern professional production would normally receive. An actor might be in one play today, and a completely different one tomorrow. There is no 6-week rehearsal period. Nobody spends 3 mornings exploring how their character moves through space. There isn't time. Your character moves through space towards the stage because there are approximately 2,000 people outside, and they've already paid. Actors could be given their own written parts, containing their speeches and their cue immediately before them, rather than necessarily possessing a complete copy of the script. So they get their part, hence the word part. So you need to know your lines, recognize your cue, and come in at the correct moment. This makes listening rather important. If the man before you forgets his final line, you may have a problem. You know you're supposed to enter. You know you're supposed to say something. You just don't know whether we're there yet. There must have been moments when an actor stood behind the stage, listening desperately for 6 particular words, while somebody outside attempted to remember what came next. And Shakespeare is sometimes one of these actors himself. We tend not to think of him that way, because history has given us the portrait. Shakespeare with the high forehead, Shakespeare holding a quill, Shakespeare looking as though he has just thought of Macbeth. But Shakespeare also has to go to work. He has colleagues, he has costumes, he has cues. He has afternoons when things presumably go better than other afternoons. And because this is live theatre, mistakes are unavoidable. We don't need to invent a particular actor dropping Yorick's skull into the audience to know that over years of frequent performances, things occasionally went wrong. A prop isn't where somebody expected it. A line disappears from an actor's mind. Someone enters too soon. Someone doesn't enter at all. And perhaps the most terrifying moment in theatre occurs. Everybody else notices. An actor can forget a line alone at home with almost no consequences. Forget it while several hundred people are looking directly at you, and suddenly the line becomes the most important collection of words in England. The audience may not even know what has gone wrong. The other actors do. There is a particular sort of look exchanged between people when one of them has forgotten something and everybody else is pretending he hasn't. 400 years later, we still use it in meetings. Shakespeare understands all of this, because he isn't writing plays to be quietly read in bedrooms. He's writing them to survive actors, audiences, weather, noise, limited rehearsal, and whatever else London has decided to provide that afternoon. And the audience provides quite a lot. They are not required to behave with the solemn restraint of a modern classical theatre audience. But it must be said that Shakespeare's genius can keep their attention. There is no darkness, no microphone, no enormous scenery, no request beforehand to switch off mobile phones. Just actors walking onto a wooden stage and beginning. And gradually, somehow, the people stop looking around. The fashionable gentleman forgets to make sure he is being noticed. The wet man forgets briefly that he is wet. Even the man with the hazelnut pauses for a minute. Something is happening on stage, and William Shakespeare has them. Part 4, in which Elizabeth I goes to the theatre, and Shakespeare gets a very important customer. While Shakespeare is building his career in London, there is one person whose presence hangs over almost everything happening in England. Queen Elizabeth I. She has been on the throne since 1558, 6 years before Shakespeare is born, and by the time he becomes successful, she has already ruled England for decades. And Elizabeth likes entertainment. This is fortunate for Shakespeare. It would have been considerably less convenient if she had developed a strong personal dislike of plays. Elizabeth's court supports music, dancing, poetry, and dramatic performance. Acting companies seek the protection of powerful patrons, and performances are regularly staged at court, particularly during the Christmas season. Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, performs for Elizabeth on numerous occasions. This means Shakespeare has a rather unusual customer. Most playwrights have to worry about whether the audience enjoyed the play. Shakespeare occasionally has to worry about whether the Queen of England enjoyed it. There is no star rating here. There is just Elizabeth, and everybody can see her. Imagine waiting for the first joke. The actors know it is funny. It worked beautifully at the Globe. Now it is performed at court, in Elizabeth's castle or palace, or wherever she happens to be. Elizabeth watches. The line comes. Tumbleweed. Nothing. Nada. This would be an extremely long 2 seconds. Fortunately, Elizabeth appears to have genuinely enjoyed theatre. We shouldn't go too far and imagine her as Shakespeare's personal supporter in the modern sense. There is no evidence that she sat around asking when his next play was coming out. But royal performances gave Shakespeare's company prestige, income, and access to the highest level of English society. And Elizabeth herself is a formidable figure. By Shakespeare's successful years, she has survived religious upheaval, political plots, threats from abroad, and the Spanish Armada of 1588. She has deliberately remained unmarried, cultivating the image of the Virgin Queen while carefully managing the complicated expectations placed upon a female monarch. Her appearance becomes part of that image. The elaborate gowns, the jewels, the white face makeup, the increasingly magnificent portraits. Elizabeth understands presentation extremely well. There is no social media. If you want the entire company to see a flattering image of you, someone has to paint it. This takes considerably longer than taking your phone out and turning it to selfie mode. And there is no deleting it later because you don't like your chin. Portraits of Elizabeth increasingly present not merely a woman, but an idea of monarchy, ageless, powerful, richly dressed, surrounded by symbols. The reality is that she is getting older. The portraits are less interested in this information. Some traditions claim Elizabeth particularly admired Shakespeare's character Falstaff, and even requested a play showing Falstaff in love, supposedly inspiring The Merry Wives of Windsor. It's a delightful story, although the evidence comes from much later, and historians treat it cautiously. Still, the idea has survived because it is irresistible. The Queen watches Falstaff. The Queen likes Falstaff. The Queen wants more Falstaff. Shakespeare goes home with the 16th century equivalent of a note from the network. Very good. More of the fat man. Whether or not it happened, Shakespeare certainly writes in a world where royal taste matters. His history plays are particularly interesting in Elizabeth's England. Plays about kings, rebellion, succession, and the transfer of power are not remote subjects. Elizabeth has no child, and therefore no direct heir. The question of what happens after her death becomes increasingly important as she ages. This means that putting a play about a disputed English crown in front of an Elizabethan audience has a little more tension than putting one in front of us. For us, it is history. For them, parts of it feel uncomfortably like current affairs, and Shakespeare needs to be careful. The theatre is watched by authorities. Plays can be censored, and companies require official permission to perform. The master of the revels has responsibility for reviewing plays before public performance. So Shakespeare is writing about kings while living under a queen. There are safer occupations. Glove making, for example. His father had already demonstrated the basic business model. But Shakespeare continues, and his company prospers. Part 5, in which Shakespeare goes to Hollywood and is not consulted. William Shakespeare dies in 1616. This creates surprisingly few problems for his film career. In fact, several centuries later, it becomes extremely successful. Shakespeare never sees a camera, a cinema, or Leonardo DiCaprio. He has no opinion on popcorn. He never has to sit through 20 minutes of trailers for films he did not come to see. And yet his stories turn out to be extraordinarily difficult to keep off the screen. Since the earliest days of cinema, filmmakers have repeatedly returned to Shakespeare. There have been hundreds of film and television adaptations of his work, ranging from fairly faithful productions in period costume to versions in which Shakespeare's original setting has been removed so completely that you can get quite a long way into the film before realizing William is involved. This is one of Shakespeare's stranger achievements. You can adapt him while hiding him. Take Romeo and Juliet. The original ingredients are fairly straightforward. Boy meets girl. Girl meets boy. Their families hate each other. Nobody handles this sensibly. 400 years later, filmmakers look at this and think, still works. The story has been filmed repeatedly, including Franco Zeffirelli's famous 1968 version and Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet in 1996, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes. Luhrmann keeps Shakespeare's language, but moves the action into a highly stylized modern setting, with cars, guns, television news, and a place called Verona Beach. Shakespeare's words survive. Almost everything around them has acquired sunglasses. And somehow it works. This is the remarkable thing about Shakespeare adaptations. You can remove the doublets, replace swords with guns, add cars and helicopters, and still discover that the basic problem remains exactly the same. Two young people are in love, and the adults have made everything unnecessarily difficult. Then there is West Side Story, the musical, and later the famous 1961 film, takes the basic structure of Romeo and Juliet and moves it to 20th century New York. The Montagues and the Capulets become rival gangs. Romeo becomes Tony, Juliet becomes Maria, Verona becomes Manhattan. There is considerably more dancing. Shakespeare did not specify dancing. This has not stopped anybody, and this becomes a pattern. The Taming of the Shrew eventually helps inspire 10 Things I Hate About You, released in 1999 and set in an American high school. This is quite a journey. A comedy written in the 1590s travels for roughly 400 years and eventually finds itself surrounded by lockers. Shakespeare's characters are now teenagers in late 1990s America. They have cars. They have school dances. Nobody wears a ruff. And an audience can enjoy the whole thing without knowing that a man born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564 has quietly entered the building. This may be the ultimate form of literary success. People are watching your work without first being warned. She's the Man later takes inspiration from Twelfth Night. Oh, released in 2001, reworks Othello in an American high school setting. And then we come to Hamlet. Hamlet has been filmed and adapted repeatedly. This is understandable, because Hamlet contains almost everything a serious actor could possibly want. Grief, revenge, madness, betrayal, a ghost, a sword fight, several very long opportunities to speak, while everybody else remains quiet. Actors love Hamlet. Playing Hamlet has become something of a career landmark, a role against which major performers can test themselves. Laurence Olivier does it. Richard Burton does it on stage. Kenneth Branagh does it. Mel Gibson does it. Benedict Cumberbatch does it on stage. At some point, a successful male actor apparently receives a letter. Congratulations on your career. It is now time to be indecisive in Denmark. Kenneth Branagh's 1996 film is particularly ambitious because it uses the complete text of the play and runs for around 4 hours. 4 hours. Shakespeare's original audience stood through performances. The modern audience gets a seat. This is fortunate. And yet, filmmakers keep returning to Hamlet because the central story remains powerful. A young man loses his father, distrusts his stepfather, struggles with what to do, and spends a remarkable amount of time thinking about it. Hamlet has one job. A ghost explains the job quite early. The remaining play demonstrates why some people should not be given tasks without a deadline. Even Disney cannot entirely escape Shakespeare. The Lion King is frequently discussed in relation to Hamlet, a prince, a dead father, a treacherous uncle, exile, and the eventual return to confront what has happened. There are obviously major differences. Most notably, Hamlet contains significantly fewer lions, but the comparison has become part of the film's cultural story. And this means there are children encountering something resembling the bones of Shakespeare while watching an animated warthog sing. William could not possibly have anticipated this. If you could bring Shakespeare forward from 1600, explaining cinema would already take some time. Then you would have to explain Disney, then animation, then talking animals, then that his Danish tragedy has somehow entered the discussion. At some point, it would be kinder simply to show him the film. But perhaps the strangest screen adaptation is not one of Shakespeare's plays. It is Shakespeare. Because eventually we decide that the man himself needs a plot. This presents filmmakers with a problem we've already encountered throughout this story. We don't know enough about him. There are enormous gaps in Shakespeare's private life. For historians, this requires caution. For screenwriters, it requires approximately 2 minutes of caution. Then somebody starts writing. The 1998 film Shakespeare in Love imagines a young Shakespeare struggling with writer's block and falling in love, while Romeo and Juliet takes shape around him. It won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It is charming. It is romantic. It is not a documentary. This distinction occasionally needs making, because the film does such a convincing job of giving Shakespeare the private life history neglected to record. We don't know precisely how Shakespeare came up with many of his ideas. Hollywood does. He was in love. Excellent. Problem solved. This is perhaps inevitable. The less we know about Shakespeare personally, the more tempting he becomes as a fictional character. There is room. Did he have a secret romance? Maybe. Did he experience some dramatic event that directly inspired a famous play? Who knows? Did he stare thoughtfully from windows while holding pieces of paper? Almost certainly at some point. We can film that. Other productions imagine different versions of him. Some portray him as romantic, some troubled, some witty, some mysterious. And every actor playing Shakespeare faces an unusual challenge. He must convincingly portray a man about whom the audience already believes one thing. He is a genius. This means Shakespeare cannot simply walk into a room. He has to walk into a room slightly like, well, Shakespeare. There may be a pause. Perhaps he notices something ordinary. Someone says something. Shakespeare looks thoughtful. You can almost see a sonnet happening, one of Shakespeare's poems. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease doth all too short a date. The real Shakespeare presumably spent a great deal of his life looking completely ordinary. He must occasionally have entered a room because he needed something from the room. No inspiration, no immortal line. A pen, or a pair of scissors. But that version rarely makes the film. And cinema has helped create our modern Shakespeare. Romantic genius, tortured artist, brilliant outsider, mysterious man with ink permanently available. The historical Shakespeare was also a businessman, shareholder, property owner, father, actor, and working writer, operating inside a busy commercial industry. But that Shakespeare occasionally has to wait outside, while the more cinematic Shakespeare gazes into the candlelight. And perhaps Shakespeare would understand this better than anyone, because he did exactly the same thing to history. His own historical plays reshape real people and events into drama. Richard III becomes one of literature's greatest villains. Henry V becomes the center of magnificent patriotic speeches. Julius Caesar's assassination becomes theater. Shakespeare takes history and changes it to make a better story. 400 years later, filmmakers take Shakespeare and do exactly the same thing to him. it seems difficult for him to complain. And that may be the strangest part of Shakespeare's journey into film. The man who spent his career borrowing, adapting, and reshaping other people's stories has himself become material. His plays are moved to New York, to American high schools, to modern cities, to animated Africa. His characters acquire cars and guns and leather jackets. His own life acquires romances nobody can prove happened. And through all of it, the stories keep working, which means somewhere tonight, somebody may be watching Shakespeare without actually knowing they're watching Shakespeare. William has once again got his audience. This time, they don't even have to stand. Part 6, in which people begin to wonder whether Shakespeare was Shakespeare. By the time William Shakespeare dies in 1616, he has been, as I've said, an actor, a playwright, a poet, a theatre shareholder, a property owner, and reasonably successful businessman. His name has appeared on published works. Other writers have referred to him. His fellow actors know him. His company performs his plays. And 7 years after his death, 2 of those fellow actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, help publish the great collection of his plays that we now call the First Folio. So, naturally, a few centuries later, people begin asking whether William Shakespeare wrote any of them. This is one of the more unusual consequences of success. Most writers would be quite pleased to be remembered 400 years after their deaths. Shakespeare has done so well that some people have removed him from his own career. The doubts don't really become a significant movement until the 19th century, more than 200 years after Shakespeare's death. During Shakespeare's own lifetime, we don't find contemporaries saying, "Hamlet is excellent. Obviously, William didn't write it." His fellow writers certainly criticize him. Robert Greene, as we've already seen, calls him an upstart crow. Ben Jonson occasionally has complicated things to say about him. But nobody appears to solve their irritation with Shakespeare by deciding he doesn't exist professionally. The problem comes much later. By the 19th century, Shakespeare has become Shakespeare. Not simply a successful Elizabethan playwright, a genius. Probably the genius. His plays demonstrate knowledge of politics, monarchy, Italy, warfare, law, classical literature, court behavior, and human psychology. And people begin looking at the known facts of his life. Born in Stratford, son of a glovemaker, probably attended the local grammar school, didn't attend university, worked as an actor. And some people think, him? It is a wonderfully strange moment. Shakespeare has become too impressive, to have written Shakespeare. One of the earliest major alternative candidates is Francis Bacon. Bacon certainly looks the part. He is highly educated, intellectually formidable, politically connected, a philosopher, lawyer, and statesman. If you were casting the role of man secretly capable of writing Shakespeare, Bacon would arrive at the audition extremely confident. In the 19th century, American writer Delia Bacon becomes a prominent advocate of the idea that the plays were produced by a small group of writers, including Francis Bacon, rather than William Shakespeare. No relation, incidentally, which feels slightly disappointing. If you're going to devote yourself to proving that Bacon wrote Shakespeare, being called Bacon ought at least to help. Other candidates eventually appear. Christopher Marlowe is suggested. This requires dealing with the inconvenient fact that Marlowe dies in 1593, while Shakespeare's career continues for another 2 decades. Supporters of the Marlovian theory have an answer. Perhaps Marlowe didn't really die. Of course. History had left an obstacle. The theory simply removed it. Marlowe, according to versions of this idea, survives secretly and continues writing plays which are then attributed to Shakespeare. This would mean that instead of merely writing the plays, Marlowe also has to fake his death, disappear, continue producing masterpieces, and arrange for another man to receive the credit. Writing King Lear suddenly becomes the easy part. Then there is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, who becomes perhaps the most famous alternative candidate in modern times. Oxford is an aristocrat. He is educated, he travels in Europe, he has connections to court. All of this appeals to people who feel the author of Shakespeare's plays must have personally experienced the worlds depicted in them. There is, however, another irritating date. Oxford dies in 1604. Several Shakespeare plays are generally dated after this. Once again, chronology has entered the room and made itself unpopular. Supporters propose different dating theories and explanations, and this is where the authorship question becomes wonderfully complicated, because once you begin with the possibility of a secret author, almost anything that appears to contradict the theory can itself become part of the theory. Why is there no evidence? Because it was secret. Why does Shakespeare's name appear? Because that was the disguise. Why do contemporary writers refer to Shakespeare? Because they were fooled, or involved, or speaking in code. At some point, William Shakespeare is doing remarkably little work in the story of William Shakespeare. The arguments against Shakespeare often focus on what we don't have. We don't have his personal library. We don't have manuscripts of the plays in his handwriting, apart from a few pages of the play Sir Thomas More that some scholars believe may contain Shakespeare's hand, though the attribution is debated. We don't have a diary explaining how he wrote Hamlet. We don't have boxes of letters discussing drafts. We don't have a photograph of him writing Macbeth with that day's newspaper clearly visible beside him. For some doubters, this absence feels suspicious. But surviving evidence from the period is patchy for many people, including writers. 400 years is a long time to keep paperwork. Most of us struggle to locate a receipt from February. Shakespeare's family was apparently expected to preserve several decades of creative drafts through civil wars, fires, damp, house moves, and centuries in which nobody yet knew that future scholars would desperately like to examine his waste paper basket. And there actually is considerable evidence connecting Shakespeare to the plays. His name appears on printed editions during his lifetime. Contemporary writers identify him as a playwright and poet. Francis Mears praises Shakespeare by name in 1598 and lists several of his plays. Ben Jonson knew Shakespeare and later praises him in the first folio. Hemmings and Condell, fellow actors who had worked with Shakespeare for years, publish that folio in 1623 and present the plays as his. This creates a rather substantial conspiracy problem. If Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare, quite a lot of people appear to be behaving as though he did. Actors, writers, publishers, friends, colleagues, people who actually knew him, and nobody leaves behind the extremely useful note, "Between ourselves, William isn't doing any of this." This is why the overwhelming majority of Shakespeare scholars accept William Shakespeare of Stratford as the author of the works attributed to him, while also recognizing that collaboration was normal in early modern theatre, and that Shakespeare probably worked with other playwrights on some plays. The last point is important. The reality is already more interesting than the neat image of a lone genius. Elizabethan theatre is collaborative. Playwrights work together. Texts change. Actors influence performance. Companies own scripts. Shakespeare almost certainly collaborates with writers, including John Fletcher later in his career, and scholars continue studying authorship within individual plays. So there really are interesting questions about who wrote particular bits. It's just that the answer is not generally an earl secretly wrote everything and gave it to the glove-maker's son. And beneath the authorship debate is something rather revealing about how we imagine genius. Some doubters have found it difficult to believe that a man without aristocratic birth or a university education could know enough to write these works. But Shakespeare probably received a demanding grammar school education steeped in Latin literature. He spent years among actors, writers, and wealthy patrons. He lived in London. He read extensively. He borrowed stories enthusiastically. And, rather importantly, Writers are allowed to make things up. Shakespeare doesn't need to be a king to write King Lear. He doesn't need to murder a Scottish monarch before writing Macbeth. We should probably be grateful for this. The careers of novelists would otherwise become extremely concerning. Nor does Shakespeare need to visit every place he writes about. His Italy, for example, is sometimes geographically questionable. In Winter's Tale, Bohemia famously has a coastline. It does not. If Shakespeare secretly travelled Europe, gathering perfect first-hand knowledge, he appears to have misplaced the map. There is also something very modern about the whole debate. We have a famous person. We have gaps in the evidence. We have mysteries. We have competing theories. We have people passionately arguing that everyone else has failed to see what is obvious. All that is missing is a 47-minute YouTube video with a thumbnail of Shakespeare looking shocked. The Truth About Hamlet is the title, all in caps. A red arrow points towards Francis Bacon. 3 million views. And perhaps Shakespeare himself would have enjoyed the whole thing. He spent his career writing mistaken identities, disguises, hidden motives, conspiracies, and people confidently believing things that aren't true. Then, centuries after his death, people look at William Shakespeare and decide, perhaps he's someone else. It is almost annoyingly appropriate. But unless convincing new evidence appears, the most straightforward explanation remains the one accepted by mainstream scholarship. William Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, often using existing sources, sometimes collaborating, working inside a commercial theatre company, revising, adapting and borrowing, like other playwrights of his period. It is not quite as mysterious as a hidden aristocrat secretly producing Hamlet, but it has one considerable advantage. We actually have evidence for it. And perhaps the strangest thing about the authorship controversy is that it demonstrates just how enormous Shakespeare's reputation has become. The boy from Stratford became so famous, his plays became so admired, and his language became so closely examined that eventually some people could no longer believe one ordinary human being had done it. William Shakespeare had achieved something few writers ever manage. He became too good to be William Shakespeare. Part 7, in which Shakespeare dies and then becomes extremely difficult to get rid of. William Shakespeare dies in Stratford-upon-Avon in April 1616, aged 52. And under normal circumstances, this would be where a person's career begins to quieten down. Shakespeare's does not. If anything, he becomes considerably busier. 7 years after his death in 1623, as I mentioned in Part 6, 2 of his former colleagues published the collection we now call the First Folio. It contains 36 of Shakespeare's plays, including 18 that had not previously appeared in print. Without it, plays including Macbeth, The Tempest, and Twelfth Night might have been lost. This means 2 actors deciding to gather their dead colleagues' work into a large book becomes one of the most important events in literary history. It is also a useful reminder to organize your files. Shakespeare himself does not appear to have made arrangements for a definitive collection of his plays. He leaves behind a will containing detailed instructions about property, money, and possessions. The plays? Apparently somebody else can sort those out. Fortunately, Hemmings and Condell do. And from there, Shakespeare begins the remarkably long process of refusing to disappear. His plays continue to be performed. They are printed, edited, and studied. His reputation grows. Actors take on Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, and Othello. The plays travel far beyond England and are translated into languages Shakespeare never heard. Eventually he becomes not merely a playwright, but an institution. Stratford changes with him. The town where nobody thought it particularly remarkable that John Shakespeare's son lived nearby becomes a destination for visitors from around the world. People travel thousands of miles to see Shakespeare's birthplace. They photograph the house. They visit his grave. They buy Shakespeare-related objects. William Shakespeare, son of a glovemaker, eventually becomes extremely successful at selling things in shops he has never seen. And then there is the language. Shakespeare's writing contains hundreds of expressions and formulations that remain familiar today. Claims that he personally invented enormous numbers of English words are often overstated. The fact that his work contains an early surviving example doesn't necessarily mean he created it, but his influence on written and spoken English is undeniable. We still encounter phrases such as break the ice, wild goose chase, heart of gold, and in a pickle in Shakespeare's works, which means you can go through an entire day accidentally quoting Shakespeare without once wearing tights. His characters survive too. Romeo and Juliet remain shorthand for young lovers. A jealous person can still be compared with Othello. Someone hesitating endlessly over a decision can be called Hamlet. And saying to be or not to be while deciding between 2 sandwiches remains legally available to everyone. Perhaps Shakespeare's strangest afterlife, though, is the classroom. For centuries, generations of children have been introduced to a man who wrote plays designed to entertain noisy crowds, and then been informed that there will be a test on Thursday. This is quite a transformation. The Elizabethan audience gets sword fights, ghosts, dirty jokes, and murder. The modern 14-year-old gets, "What do you think Shakespeare is suggesting in line 17? Shakespeare did not arrange this. He cannot be held responsible. And yet the plays keep escaping the classroom too. They return to theatres. They become films. They become musicals. They are moved into different countries and different centuries. They are performed in modern clothes, ancient clothes, and occasionally almost no clothes whatsoever, because somebody has had an idea. Every generation seems convinced that Shakespeare needs updating, and Shakespeare continues surviving the updates. That may ultimately be his greatest achievement. Not that every line is perfect, not that every play is equally loved, not that he single-handedly invented half the English language, but that 4 centuries after his death, people still recognize the people he wrote. The jealous husband, the ambitious couple, the teenager desperately in love, the man who cannot make up his mind, the powerful father whose children are becoming a problem. Times change. Apparently families do not. Shakespeare began as a boy in Stratford, whose exact birthday we cannot even prove. He became an actor, a working playwright and a businessman, who wrote entertainment for people standing in a noisy theatre, some of whom were eating nuts. He could not have known which lines would survive. He could not have known that his plays would still be performed 400 years later. And he certainly could not have known that millions of school children would one day be required to explain what he meant. Perhaps that is for the best. It might have made him nervous. So, William Shakespeare dies in 1616, and more than 4 centuries later, we're still performing him, filming him, quoting him, studying him, arguing about him, and occasionally insisting that somebody else wrote him. For a man who left behind remarkably little information about himself, he has proved extremely difficult to shut up.